The title is The Call of Wonder. I came up with it because a lot of people have made this comment before. Wonder is the experience that philosophy, theology, and science all share. And so wonder, I talk about it in the first chapter, wonder not in the sense of imagination, wonder not in the sense of CGI movies, but authentic wonder where it's a mystery to the mind of a reality larger than yourself.
Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. Well, my guest this week is someone who challenges the rigid, often absolutist narratives that define so much of our cultural commentary these days in a world that pushes us to choose sides, God or science, faith or reason, tradition or progress. Brian Cranley asks, why must we choose at all? In his new book, The Call of Wonder, How the God of Reason Created Science in His Image, he confronts the dogmatic binary structures that leave no room for nuance, complexity, or coexistence. Ryan invites us to rethink what we think we know. And the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. And for everything about Brian, go to Brian Cranley, that's with an E, briancranley.com, and you can follow him on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. And Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ira. Honored to be here.
Pleasure. So tell us a little bit first about how your background brings you to this moment in time, because you're involved in medical supplies, which is not exactly the most faith-connected combination I've seen. So how did you end up going from that to thinking and then writing about this book, which I think is a good idea to challenge because people are so absolutist, as I mentioned in the opening, with their thoughts that you can't be one or the other. But before we get into that, how did you start this road?
Well, that is a great question. So I have sort of a journey I've been on, but basically when I was younger, I wanted to be a doctor, and my dad and I discussed a love for physics and math. So I majored in biomedical engineering in the idea of going to med school. But then after college, I felt something of a calling. And so I left engineering and the idea of medicine. So I was in the sciences and the medical sciences. Then I went towards this education in philosophy and theology, where I spent 5 years doing a master's of divinity at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. So at the end of that, I finished the degree, but decided not to go into ministry. So I had that degree. Then I went back to the medical device world because biomedical engineers kind of work in sales if you are more people oriented and kind of like that side of it. So I went back to the sort of medical device technology world. And, for a long time, I never thought I would use the philosophy and theology degree. But for many years, probably for 15 years, all that education just percolated in my mind. And it was, floating around up there until one day the love for the two fields kind of came together in this crazy way. And I looked all over the internet to see if anybody had said this specific thing before, and they hadn't. So I decided to write a book about it.
Now, it'd be funny if, because it's not and no offense to you, it's not an original thought. I think a lot of us have thought about that. Why can't you be both faith-based and also scientifically based? And there's been scientists through the years, decades that I am aware of, who are religious people, and yet at the same time they're scientists. So
Yeah.
you decided though to put it together as a book, which I guess hasn't been written before. And when you approached it, what was your baseline for starting this discussion?
Well, you're very right. This argument has been made by tons of scientists, philosophers throughout the ages that faith and science can go together. And there's the first half of my book. In fact, I try to trace the history of philosophers, scientists, and the divide between faith and science and how they go together. What my contribution is in this book in particular is the claim that the more we find out about science, from things like the Big Bang, evolutionary science, the more God's image comes into focus, as though he wrote his image into science. And so that specific way that they go together is what the second half of this book is really about, which I'm still just thrilled to even think about the ideas today. So it's an ongoing conversation, but I think a lot of modern readers don't realize the history the centuries that have gone into this debate. So I wanted to provide in the first half of the book that context for people so they could get a quick summary of the conversation for the last 2,000 years and kind of catch up.
Yeah, it takes a while to get caught up on that
Yeah.
part of the time. I find it interesting that the people that I encounter, if you are, and this isn't for everybody, but in general, people who are religious accept science. There are those that don't, but there are people who are religious accept science. Yet there's less people who consider themselves science-based who don't accept religion. They can't see that you can
hmm
both. I don't know where that mentality comes from. Did you find what's the cause of that in your research?
Yeah. Well, the cause of it in myself, my experience was when I
It's
was
even
growing
better.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, in myself, I would notice that I would go through these periods of just falling in love with science. I have a natural love for James Webb Telescope, the Hubble Telescope, all the images of deep space. And I would, learn about evolution, and I would kind of keep it on one side of my brain. And then I would go to church, learn about the book of Genesis, the theology, and I would keep that over here on this side of the brain. And the sort of cognitive dissonance, the difficulty would come when I would try to bring them together. And so I started with a sort of an obsession of, if this is true and this is true, then they have to go together. I just couldn't get that out of my head. And so finally, when I was sort of kicking and screaming while studying philosophy, it's in some of that Greek philosophy that I found a way to reconcile the two. And that's what I hope to bring to readers with this book is, maybe another way to look at it so that you can bring them together in your own mind, or at least, look at the two sides with an open mind.
I think that's the important part that people skip over, which is to have an open mind. You
Yeah.
don't have to be convinced, but you at least have an open mind about these subjects. And I find more and more people are taking, as I mentioned in the opening, where they just take sides, one side or the other, and they can't seem to do it. I know that one of the things that always amazed me was during the COVID era, there was that phrase that was out created in some boiler room, I would imagine, and distributed to the
hmm
population that the science is settled. Well, the science is never settled, as we clearly know, given centuries of what
Yeah.
all these different scientists have discovered or claim at one point in time. Well, this is, that the sun or the earth, the earth revolves around the sun versus the sun
Yeah.
revolving around the earth. It's a bad example. I tripped over it a little bit here, but it's to my point, which is that there's nothing that's totally settled. And because if you do have it settled, then you're not going to explore or research or do any more investigation about something that you are thinking about. And I'm talking too much. I'm going to let you talk more as the guest, but it's just, to me, it's a fascinating subject, and I'm glad you wrote the book about it. How did you come up with the title, which I thought was very clever, actually?
Yeah. The title is The Call of Wonder. I came up with it because a lot of people have made this comment before. Wonder is the experience that philosophy, theology, and science all share. And so, wonder, I talk about it in the first chapter, wonder not in the sense of imagination, wonder not in the sense of CGI movies, but authentic wonder where it's a mystery to the mind of a reality larger than yourself, where you kind of get lost in this bigger thing. That's my simplified version of wonder. But the call of wonder came because I believe in God. So I believe God is calling to us through the created world. And it's that innate desire to know the world around us, the universe, ourselves, that he put in us to seek him through the created world. And it's also what he put in us to seek him through theology, through the scriptures, through philosophy. And so that innate desire that we need to know more, which, no other animal does this. We just want to know more, more, more. And we're sort of unsatiated. So that calling is sort of the unifying experience that I try to tie in throughout the book of philosophy, theology, and science, because I'm trying to bring three different worlds together in this. But to your point earlier about science does change, the greatest example I can think of for that is the Big Bang theory, which came out, in earlier in the 20th century. Is that for centuries, philosophers and scientists always thought the empty black space of the universe was static and eternal. It's always been sitting there. And so when science found out that we're in a dynamic expanding universe that started from, a pinpoint the size of an atom, this was really difficult for the atheist materialist scientists at the time. Now it's kind of been turned in our modern world to be sort of somehow it's a materialist argument, that we don't need God because of that. But back in the day, when we first discovered that the universe was expanding, that was a real problem for an atheist. So you're right, the science does change. But what I'm excited about is, and I want to convey this to the readers, is we don't have to fear that. If you're a believer in God, whether it's Jewish, Islam, Christianity, whatever the faith, if you're a believer in God, you don't have to be afraid of finding more out about science that it's somehow going to destroy your faith, because I think God's revealing himself the more we find out.
Well, I think the second part of your title, how the God of reason created science in his image, which I think is actually very, even more to me, meaningful than even the wonder aspect, the call of wonder. It's just the fact that you're establishing that here's a God and it's a God of reason, and he created science specifically for everybody. Without getting too theological, it's really more I think, a practical approach to the subject. That's what you lay out in your book. Have you
Yeah.
had discussions with atheists about this subject, and do you automatically get pushback? I'm not talking about agnostic or someone who is Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, but or other religions as well, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. We always leave a lot of other religions out when we kind of
Yeah.
list religions, but
In the
that's
West. Yeah.
yeah, in the West is a shorthand, Western shorthand. But so I don't want to leave anybody out. But the when you're talking to someone who's religious versus someone who's agnostic versus someone who is what they define as an atheist, do you have these conversations with an atheist, and do you ever get a slight acknowledgement that you may have a point, or is it always pushback?
That is a great question. I wrote the book to join the atheist conversation, honestly. That's why I tried to include as many religions as I knew about to discuss that. And so I have had some very meaningful conversations with some atheists who are genuine. They're authentically seeking the truth of things, and they're honest, which I love. And what this one guy in particular I'm thinking of, the beautiful conclusion we came to is, he said, if I'm being intellectually honest, I have to say I cannot prove there is no God. And if you're being intellectually honest, you cannot definitively prove there is a God. And so we came to this common ground, which I've been thinking about for months, is that perhaps the leap of faith isn't that big of a leap. I mean, I feel like we're responsible to kind of gather the information and then make our decision based on the information that we each gather individually. And one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to give people the rational arguments for God's existence that are apart from revealed religion. So the reason why I subtitled it "The God of Reason" is because there's a whole conversation in religious philosophy, from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. In Judaism, it goes through Maimonides. In Christianity, it goes through Augustine and Aquinas, and in Islam, Averroes and Avicenna. But they all differentiate this description of God that's separate from revealed religion, and that is kind of belongs to the world of reason and logic. And so that's the image of God I went with. And the atheists are. I have a few atheist friends that are reading it currently, so I'm excited to hear what they have to say. But yeah, I really enjoy that conversation.
There seems to be a subset of atheists. I know people who are atheists, and there's different types. One
Yes.
one segment is one who is not necessarily cynical about religion or questioning about religion, but almost there's an antipathy there. And I sometimes think that it stems from the use of religion in centuries past, that religion was used as an excuse to massacre people or to do other bad things. And so I think that's where they come from, that they think religion is a con used to justify immoral or illegal acts, or genocide, even for that matter. But I would think of as your friend, where it's an honest atheist who says, I don't know, I just don't believe in it, but I
Hmm.
can't tell you why I don't believe in it. I just don't see it. I live a moral life. I lead an ethical life. Um, I treat people well. I have a family. I go to work every day. So why do I need God? So what do you say to that kind of situation where
Yeah.
maybe they don't need God in that case.
Oh, so many thoughts there. So yes,
Well,
the
that's why I'm here to bring you up.
yeah, so many thoughts. How much time do we have? So to that honest argument, there are two pretty good arguments in atheism. One is the problem of evil and suffering, which religion has a hard time answering. Not an impossible time, just a difficult time. And then the other one is that if you study science, it from one angle, it does appear that there's natural explanations for things that happen, except, how the Big Bang came into existence, the whole universe out of nothing. I think that's pretty difficult to explain, but it seems like there's scientific explanations. And so if they come up with their evidence and they decide, I don't believe there's a God, then all I know from that is that they can't say there is no God definitively proven, like science has spoken and it's proven. I know they can't go there. At least I haven't heard that argument yet. So, I don't know. That's what I would say. And, in my own mind, if you read the book, I feel like everything good in life is coming from God. So maybe they think they don't need God, but maybe they're enjoying the benefits of existence, you know, with him here.
Well, what do you say to people that quote Marx, where religion is the opiate of the people, or even a potential addiction in the sense that someone who's addicted to drugs or alcohol finds God, and then they become almost overly religious, if there is that term. Uh,
Yep.
that's their new addiction. How do you address that kind of issue?
Well, that kind of brings up your last point. So people have misused religion throughout history. And what I specifically tried to do in the book is get away from moral agency within religions, like people that have acted good, people that have acted bad. What I do in the book is isolate just the ideas. What is the actual theological idea in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, in philosophy? What are the ideas? It's trying to be a book about ideas and not about, um, I didn't address the problem of suffering. I didn't address, is God good? Things like that. Have people misused religion throughout history to cause mass genocide? Yes, they have. And that's a terrible thing. But what do the religions themselves teach? Well, what are the actual ideas? Let's go there. Let's focus on that. And then I think that makes for a clearer conversation. But again, it's based on the God of reason and ideas, which is fascinatingly woven into almost every faith. But a lot of people just don't know that. I just happened to get that in my education. I didn't even know that until I went to seminary school. So,
Do you
yeah,
think your friends, you mentioned that you gave the book to read, the atheists, do you think that they will, well, you're probably, we don't know how they're going to respond to it,
yeah,
but are you optimistic that they will at least meet you halfway?
yeah. I mean, the ones that are my friends, I think because we have that relationship set up, they definitely will. I've had some more, I guess, heated encounters online when I post certain things
Right.
from people I don't know. However, I got into a weekend long conversation with an atheist who was extremely intelligent and he knew every argument that I knew. He was obviously trained in philosophy. And so that was a great learning experience for me because I got to hear what I felt like are the best of the atheist arguments. And they're legitimate arguments. I mean, if believers don't take it seriously, then we're not going to have common ground to have a discussion. And that's where that polarizing effect happens, where you feel forced to choose religion or science, materialism. If you And Aristotle talks about this, the virtue is the mean between the two extremes. If you hold on to one extreme and you can't even acknowledge the other person's point that they have a point, then there's no common ground to have the discussion.
Well, that's what we see now in the political world in
Yeah.
our current environment. But for you, what would be a common ground, or what would be the common ground? If there may be more than one common ground, but if you were to pick a common ground, what would you see it being if you gave that book to your friend who's an atheist and they had an absolutist position, but now they've read your book and they see your points, but they're still not coming to your way of thinking, which is fine. What
Which
would
is
be the
fine.
common ground that you both could meet on that you'd be comfortable with, let alone your friend being comfortable with? Because that's really the nub of it, as I see it. In other words, you're promoting the idea, and rightly so, that you can come to a common ground. But what would be comfortable for you, having the knowledge that you have, the studying that you've done, the writing that you've done, and your firm convictions? what's your comfort level with getting to a quote unquote common ground?
Yeah. So the common ground, again, I think goes back to ideas and the logic, the logical arguments behind the existence of God. For instance, Aristotle talks about a first cause, an unmoved mover. And the idea is everything is caused by something else, or everything is moved by something else. So if you rewind the clock far enough, there had to be something that pushes over the first domino in the long dominoes of just change and motion in general. And so that's just a basic idea from logic. There has to be something that stands outside of time and change in order to cause time and change to start. And that was woven into, each of the faiths that I talk about as a way to explain their theology. And so if I talk to an atheist about that idea, what do you think about the first cause argument? Then he says, "Oh, I know the first cause argument, and here's what I think about it. Here's why I don't think it's necessary." He says his argument on why it is, but the common ground is the rational, logical idea, which I just personally find fascinating behind religion. That there are these rational reasons to believe that are woven into our faiths, and a lot of them are ancient and they've stood the test of time and they're worth reading. So I'm trying to kind of get them out there again, in a sense.
Can you give us an example of in modern society what a great common ground would be for those who are religious and believe in the existence of God, and those who are atheistic and don't believe at all in the role of God in their lives?
Yeah, I think the common ground that we have to come to today is looking at the science honestly. And I think when religious believers try to force maybe a super literal interpretation of Genesis, you're not on common ground to have a discussion with a non-believer who believes in a 13.8 billion year old Earth, our universe, and life that's 4 billion years old. So if what I tried to do in my book was take the science as it is, and I know science is changing, but we know a lot of fascinating things from particle colliders, things like that. And so if you look at the science exactly how it is, I feel like I can have a conversation with an atheist just on the science.
Mhm.
And what I tried to do is show how God wrote his image into that science. So I feel like that's common ground, is starting with the science as we find it.
Do you think that, are you optimistic that your approach can work? And what I'm thinking of is there are people on each of the sides, one on science, one on religion, that have absolutist positions. And looking at just the religious side as an example, you have fanatics of all kinds that believe that their God is one way and
Mhm.
no other way. And then you have atheists who believe their way is one way, and they're antagonistic to religion, even if it's not the extreme version of a religion. So are you optimistic that this middle ground, or at least a partial middle ground, can be formed?
I am, with one caveat to that. I do believe, as I said earlier, that your personal experience of God or of no God, I think, is the final decider on whether or not you believe. So, what I'm doing here is sort of laying groundwork to find a common ground, to allow people to have rational reasons. Like, say I'm an agnostic. I don't even have a rational reason to believe in God because all I've heard is he's the old man in the cloud that judges me. So once I have these rational ideas, I'm now at least to almost even. But as far as do I have a personal experience of God that confirms his existence for me personally, I think that's the final step that each person either comes to or they don't. And my book is trying to kind of help you get to that place where you could have an experience and be open to it. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but I think the book does a good job of helping people feel okay in believing in a God from a rational sense.
What do you do with the pressures of society and the way we live in our culture, and in the sense that you have consumerism as an example, you have political divide. And I'm thinking that there's an awful lot of people in any country that are geared to either surviving economically, or they already survived and they're in a rich country and they're 100% 24/7 consumers, and that's their world. They don't think about philosophy, religion, greater good, or any of those concepts. How do you reach, or can you reach those people. And there's a lot of them out there, no matter what society you're in.
Yeah. Well, I am
I mean,
trying to get
I
ahead.
hate to give you these important questions, but you're the author, so that's why
This is everything I thought about because I'm in sales. I wanted to market the book. So the title is
I'm
supposed to be a hook in a sense of the experience of wonder. I'm trying to get ahead of this trend that I think people are going to get exhausted scrolling social media, finding shallow content. I think the human intellect, the human soul wants the depth, the mystery, something real, and you just can't find it. It's getting harder and harder to find a really good movie that has a meaning to it. And I think people are getting like sick in a sense of just the shallow content out there. So with the title, The Call of Wonder, I'm trying to get people, hey, there's something better over here. And I tried to present the philosophy as gently as possible because yeah, I just had so many preconceived notions about philosophy when I went in and I was not excited to study it. And now I can't stop thinking about it. It literally changed the way I think forever. And so I'm trying to get people to say, hey, look over here. There's real wonder, there's real mystery, and you could spend the rest of your life thinking about these ideas, and your mind will never fully figure it out and never get tired. I think Frank Sheed, the theologian, said it's a well, mystery is a well that never runs dry. You can go back to it all day long if you want it for the rest of your life. And so there's something better out there, is what I'm trying to I guess communicate to
No, no,
people.
I see what you're saying, but my question was really more, how do you approach people who the concept of wonder never enters their brain? They're too busy eating junk food and kind of just looking for pleasure in all the wrong places in a way. How do
Well,
you
I'm going
reach
to
those
start a YouTube
people?
channel. Try to reach them on social media.
Maybe that's the way to do it, just because, yeah, the scrolling could drive you crazy after a while, and people
Yeah.
realize scrolling is almost the same as eating non-nutritional food. You crave it, but it's not really giving you satisfaction, and you're
Yeah.
looking for something deeper in your life. So that makes perfect sense. When you finish the book, we only have about a minute left, though. When you finished the book and you shared it with your family and friends, was it was the feedback good in the sense that they thought you hit the spot that you were aiming for, or did they give you suggestions to add additional chapters?
Great question. I think they were kind of surprised because I thought about these topics for probably 15, 20 years and rarely spoke about them. So when I gave the book to all my friends and family, they were kind of surprised that I wrote it. They definitely gave me some great feedback on how to make it more, I guess, relatable for people because it covers a lot of dense topics. So yeah, they were excited for me. They were somewhat surprised, and they gave me some good feedback on how to make it more relatable to the average reader who doesn't have this background, because that's really who I'm going for. Is how do I give somebody the education that I was blessed to receive from some great teachers? How do I get it to them? And basically, it's like 4 chapters. You get my entire philosophy education summarized. So yeah, it was good feedback. But I'm really excited to see how it does on the mass market.
Well, that's a great way to leave it. My guest has been Brian Cranley. He's author of The Call of Wonder, How the God of Reason Created Science in His Image. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. And for everything about Brian, go to Brian Cranley with an E, Cranley, briancranley.com, and you can follow him on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube. And Brian, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Ira.
And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.